Good day, grade 11 students. I am teacher Giselle Esquinas of Mogs Senior High School. So I will be your teacher for General Biology 1 for this semester. So to begin with, I hope you have already answered your modules on lesson 1. And this video lesson will serve as a further discussion on what you have read on your modules. So I hope you learned something today, and there will be more videos given to you within this semester. So General Biology 1 deals with um, cells, or this is the so-called cell biology. So I will be presenting to you videos and slides in which you can further understand what cell biology is. Okay, so allow me to present my PowerPoint on this topic. Okay. Okay, so actually, for this semester, we'll be discussing on or dealing with the world of the cell. Okay, you really know, I think you are quite aware and you have ideas on what a cell is. Okay, so again, General Biology 1 deals with the world of the cell. This is the so-called cellular biology or simply cell biology. So we will be first dealing with the cell structure and the different classification of cells. And we will be learning more as we go on through this semester. Okay, so to begin with, let's have a video showing, okay, let's have a video showing or showcasing the different cells on our body, in our body rather. So I hope you enjoy and watch closely. Okay, so how was it? So actually, this is a Gregorio educational production. So thank you. I got this from YouTube. So actually, no, cells are very minute or tiny parts of us. Okay, this is a building block of life. So the cell itself has very tiny parts within it, performing different functions. And as you can see, there are a lot of types of cells our body has. And these cells are actually a lot, are running around our bodies, within our bodies. So don't you think it's really amazing to have these cells running around or within our bodies, performing different functions, as well as moving around with different functions, and daghan kaayo sila, diba? So no one could actually specifically discuss everything, no? Or the different chemical reactions that cells undergo each and every day. So without these cells, how would our life be? Is life really possible without this basic building block of life? So let's see and learn more. Okay, so let's go back to the slides we have earlier. Okay, so again, General Biology 1 deals with cell biology. Okay, so let's have an introduction to cell biology. Okay, before anything else, let's have key objectives to discuss. First, we'll pinpoint and explain the three postulates of the cell theory, which we have, which you have already answered, no, on your modules. First module for biology that I have given you. Then we will trace the timeline of cell theory developments. I know you have already encountered or naila-ilahan na ninyo ang mga scientists behind the cell theory. To compare and contrast the cell theories of prominent biologists, and to differentiate unicellular and multicellular organisms. Okay, so now, before we proceed, let's have this question. Have you ever wondered what are some characteristics the living organisms share? Or in other words, kita nga tao, what are some characteristics na atong gina-share with other organisms, including animals and plants? Unsay common sa tuwa? Okay, so with that, let's have another video to showcase what are some characteristics of living organisms. Since we're dealing with biology, bio means life, right? So as a living organism, have you asked yourself, what is really the common characteristics that we have? So let's have this video. Okay. Okay, enjoy watching. Okay, so this is yet another Gregorio Educational Production. So I really love their videos, no? Okay, they're actually showcasing the things you really want to know in life. Okay, so basically there are different characteristics that we have observed in the video, right? So the question is, water, for example, moves, but is it a living organism? Diba? Hindi. So what are some characteristics really that could what consider something as living? So okay, let's go back to our slide. So actually, there are different characteristics of living organisms, okay, discussed or shown in the video earlier. So here are the following. Okay, movement, reproduction, sensitivity, growth, respiration, excretion, and nutrition. That is according to this site, bbc.co.uk. Okay, so I got this from this source. So number one is movement. Okay, the very good example, of course, is ourselves. We can move. Animals can move. But how about plants? They're considered living organisms. But do they move? The question is, do they move? And the answer is yes. They actually move in such a way that they grow according to where the light source is. So they grow towards the area or places where there is light, because light is essential for plants, although they don't move just like us from one place to the next, but they move through the different stimulus that causes them to respond to their environment, such as sunlight. So they grow towards areas where there is light. Second is reproduction. In the video earlier, it was shown that fire also reproduces as well as clouds, but they're non-living. Okay, us humans, we reproduce as well as plants and animals. Okay, third is sensitivity. So sensitivity in the sense that we are sensitive to our environment. We react kung unsay naa sa environment. For example, if we hold on to something hot, we what? How do we react or respond to that? Of course, we move away from that hot object because it causes us to get hurt. Next is growth. So as humans, from babies, from fetus to an adult, we grow as well as plants and animals. For respiration, we are able to exchange different gases from our environment and towards the environment. For example, is oxygen. We inhale oxygen and we exhale or remove carbon dioxide from our body. As well, true to plants as well as animals as well. Then excretion, we excrete or remove unclean substances from our body, such as feces, okay, from the food we eat. Then we excrete that because they are no longer needed by our bodies. The same way with animals and plants. Then for nutrition, we take in food to fuel our bodies. True to plants and animals. So without one of these characteristics, okay, if there is only one characteristic, two or three, not all of these characteristics listed here are found in a certain object, then that is considered non-living. Okay, to become a living organism or a living thing, we should have all of these characteristics. Okay, so that's it. That's just a preliminary introduction since biology deals with life. Okay, so now let's focus on what is found on your module. So before anything else, take note that the cell theory timeline This is from Miss Stelling. I got this from the internet, of course. Before we begin, actually, the dates here or the year varies. Okay, so these are actually approximates. Approximate lang ni sila ng mga dates or years. There may be some variations. But before we proceed, let's have a last video now for this lesson. Showing to you that the timeline or the cell theory timeline. Okay, so let's have this last video before we proceed with our lesson. Okay, let's have the wacky history of the cell theory by Lauren Royal Woods. Enjoy!
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are 3 parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck 2 together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where 2 German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious. but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
Okay, so thank you, Ted Ed, for that very specific or detailed history of how the cell theory came about. Okay, so back to our slides. So actually, class, the scientists mentioned there were actually interconnected. So they communicated with each other, they shared their thoughts. Okay, so right here, those mentioned there will be discussed right here in the cell theory timeline. Okay, and specifically later on, I will also give you details on the prominent scientists and their contributions to the cell theory. So let's begin with 334 BC. Okay. So in 334 BC, actually Aristotle was the first one who classified all known organisms as either plant or animal. As simple as that. And classification was that an organism might be a plant or an animal. So that was actually 334 BC, approximately 384 to 322 BC. By 1590, we have two scientists, Hans and Zacharias Janssen, produced the first compound microscope. So we already know what a microscope is, perhaps during your junior high school. Okay. By 1665, we have the scientist Robert Hooke. He was the one who observed that quark cells through compound microscope, and he was the first one to coin the term cells. In the video, you have seen Robert Hooke discussed or observed that cells are actually coined cells because they are like mini tiny rooms, okay, with different compartments. By 1680, Anton van Leeuwenhoek observed the lining of cells through a simple microscope. Okay, then by 1838, Matthias Schleiden discovered plants were actually made up of cells. By 1839, right here, Theodor Schwann, also mentioned in the video earlier, he said all animals are actually made up of cells. So if si Matthias Schleiden plants ang iyang gi-observe that are actually made up of cells, si Theodore Schwann observed that animals also have cells, just like us humans. By 1856, this person or this scientist was not mentioned in the video earlier, but for additional information, William H. Perkin develops a purple dye, which is used to stain slides. So if you have already tried viewing under the microscope in your laboratory before, as you can see, na-color no ang prepared slides. So this purple dye can assist you in viewing the different parts of the organism or the sample. Then by 1858, Rudolf Virchow says or stated that cells are the last link in a great chain that forms tissues, organs, systems, and even individuals. Okay, so let's proceed. Okay, so to proceed, so let's have this cell history. Let's specifically discuss some of those mentioned during a discussion on the previous slide. In 1650, again, Hans and Zacharias Janssen produced the first microscope. So these are the scientists mentioned. We have Hans and Zacharias. They discovered this first microscope. Actually, mura siya tube lang, and the opposite ends are actually has lenses. So more like a telescope. Okay, that's the very first microscope, as you can see, with lenses at both ends. Okay, so take note of their contribution. Next, by 1665, we have Robert Hooke. Okay, again, slice a piece of cork, the cork that you know that covers a bottle of wine. That's the cork. Okay, he sliced a piece of cork and examined it under the compound microscope. He also has his own microscope. So kanya-kanya silang version. Okay, so as you can see, this is his version of his own microscope. You put the specimen right here in the specimen holder. Then you look or observe the specimen using the eyepiece. Okay, so he was the first one to coin and give the name of the cells. Okay, this is actually published in his book entitled Micrographia. So that's the contribution of Robert Hooke. Take note. Next. Okay, this is in his book, 1665 book, Micrographia. So as you can see, he sliced a piece of cork, and if viewed under the microscope, okay, moni siyang itsura. So, fun fact, this is actually a cork is a dried piece or part of a bark of a tree, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so what is left here are actually the cell walls. Okay, cell walls which are made up of the protein called cellulose. So this is only the part that is left when a death of a bark of a tree occurs. So thus, he coined the term cells. Next. Okay, next part of the cell history is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. During 1680, he discovered the so-called animalcules in water. So in the video, he also has his own version of the microscope. This is actually his microscope. You just hold this part here with your hand and closely view an object using, okay, the small lens found at the middle portion of this mini microscope. So again, Anton van Leeuwenhoek or Antony van Leeuwenhoek, there are two versions of his name, but the most common is, of course, Anton. We know him as Anton van Leeuwenhoek. So again, remember that Anton van Leeuwenhoek has his microscopic observations, even the gunk of his teeth, now he observed. Hence, he discovered the bacteria cells. Okay. Also, he discovered or observed white blood cells, red blood cells, yeast cells, as well as sperm cells. So every day he brings with him his microscope and observe the different cells around him. Okay, next. Between the Hooke-Leeuwenhoek discoveries up to mid-19th century, there were very little cell advancements were made. Okay, so hence there was the so-called theory on spontaneous generation. It was widely accepted. When you say spontaneous, kalit-kalit lang mo appear ang meaning ana. Okay, this is the hypothetical process by which living organisms develop from non-living matter. Okay, do you believe or do you agree with this theory? Diba, remember, theory is not yet proven and not accepted. It's not a law. So actually, do you think a piece of what? An object, or for example, a stapler. For example, a stapler, can this turn into something living from being non-living? Can this turn into a living organism? Okay, that was the theory on spontaneous generation. Okay, so research on this theory and Louis Pasteur's experiment. So you may read more on what is spontaneous generation and Louis Pasteur's experiment. Okay, actually I prepared this. This is actually from, I googled this one and found this picture. This is the so-called recipe for mice by Dr. Jan Baptista von Helmont. Okay, for example, we have a dirty shirt, mga labhonon. You add on wheat, which is actually a food source of different organisms. Then you add 21 days duration. Then, according to this recipe for mice, it turns into mice after 21 days. So do you agree with this? Okay, this is the theory of spontaneous generation. Imagine a non-living organism. Okay. Imagine a non-living thing. Dirty shirt, wheat. 21 days, it turns into mice. So it is something unbelievable and unacceptable, right? So experiments actually disproved the so-called spontaneous generation. And this was actually provided by Francesco Redi during his 1668 experiment and Louis Pasteur's experiment during 1859. Okay, so for Francesco Redi, he set up 3 jars. So 3 setups. First, he placed meat. Okay. He placed a piece of meat in an open jar. The second one is he placed meat in a gauze covered jar, so meaning a slight opening. It's a gauze or a piece of cloth na ay mga tiny holes. And the third one, he placed meat, but this time it's sealed. So for the first jar, flies entered and laid eggs that hatched maggots. For the second, no flies entered, but they laid eggs on the gauze. And since na ay mga tiny holes sa gauze, eggs fell through the gauze and hatched on the meat. In the third jar, no flies, no maggots were seen, since no flies and no eggs can enter. So therefore, this disproved that a piece of meat can actually turn into something living, okay, like the maggots. So that's why if you leave a piece of meat outside, flies will gather over it, laid eggs, and therefore that's why in a few days maggots will be seen. Okay, so but if you seal the meat, there will be no flies and no maggots and eggs that could enter. The second one that disproved the theory on spontaneous generation is that of Louis Pasteur. So a broth or chicken broth, okay, is placed in an open flask. The second one, he also placed broth, but this time cotton plug filtered bacteria from the air. Okay, the third one is with this flask with the long neck. So what happened? So the broth that is exposed in an open flask becomes contaminated with bacteria. Okay, for after 1 hour to sterilize. Then the second setup, the broth, okay, was left sterile because a cotton plug filtered bacteria from the air. So take note, bacteria is present in our environment. They're flying around. Okay, they can contaminate your food when left open for several hours. Then the broth with a long neck, placed in a flask with long neck, remained sterile. So therefore, there is no spontaneous generation. So a broth can never turn into a living organism called bacteria spontaneously. Okay, so therefore, spontaneous generation was disproved and it's not accepted. Okay, next. By 1831, Robert Brown discovered the nucleus in cells. So when you say or mention the name Robert Brown, okay, this is Robert Brown. He discovered the nucleus in cells. Okay, so we will discuss further the different parts of the cell on the second video lesson to be presented to you. Then by 1835, Felix du Jardin discovered cells. So additionally, this was not mentioned in the video earlier. He discovered that cells have a living substance called sarcode or protoplasm. Okay, so what is protoplasm? Okay, protoplasm was actually further discussed by Johannes Purkinje. Okay, he was the one who named the living component of the cell as protoplasm, and together with another scientist, this one, Hugo von Moll, established the protoplasm concept. But what is exactly a protoplasm? So this is the protoplasm. Simply put, protoplasm is actually the nucleus included there along with the cytoplasm. So this is another term for protoplasm in general terms. Okay, so take note, cytoplasm is a transparent, semi-solid or gelatinous fluid that surrounds the nucleus. So it contains organelles and cytosol. Okay, so we will know the different parts of the cell later on. Next. Okay, we also have mentioned in the video, during 1838, Matthias Schleiden discovered that plant parts are actually made up of cells. So this one is actually viewed under the microscope. It is actually green in color, given that plants have this green color because of their pigment, the chlorophyll. Okay, so cells are also found in the plant parts. Okay, as you can see there, okay, these are clumps of cells. Okay, next. 1839, Theodore Schwann discovered that animals are made up of cells too, particularly muscle and nerve fiber tissues, and he coined the term from his name, Schwann cell. The Schwann cell is this one. Okay, covering a part of your neuron. Okay, this pink is actually stained, prepared slide, which can be viewed under the microscope. So this one is a muscle fiber tissue, okay, with the nucleus. So these are actually cells of an animal. Okay. Then, by 1858, Rudolf Virchow stated that all living cells come from pre-existing living cells, and also disproved that there is no spontaneous generation. Okay, so he said that from a mother cell, okay, it undergoes cell division, okay, called the mitosis, if you're familiar, and it gives off 2 daughter cells. Okay, so 2 cells come from a pre-existing mother cell. So walay spontaneous generation. Next. Okay, this cell theory is universal for all living things, no matter how simple or complex, tiny or huge it is. So hence, the cell theory has 3 postulates, according to what was discussed and given or mentioned by the different scientists. Okay, we have 3 postulates. Can you rearrange the words? I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, so what do you think are the 3 postulates? Can you guess? Okay, so have you guessed it correctly? So let's see. Okay, the 3 postulates. Number 1, all living things are composed of 1 or more cells. Number 2, the cell is the basic unit of life in all living things. And number 3, all cells come from pre-existing cells. So these are the 3 cell theory postulates that you have to remember always. Okay, so unsay meaning sa number 1? So ato pa, kita na organism, we have different types of cells, diba? So we are composed of 1 or more cells. We have skin cells, we have cardiac cells, muscle cells, liver cells, and so on. So remember that cells actually are the building blocks of the different organs and tissues that you know. Number 2, the cell is a basic unit of life in all living things. Number 3, all cells come from pre-existing cells. To explain these further, no? We'll discuss it later on. So unicellular or multicellular, what's the difference? From the term uni, 1 cell. Multicellular, meaning more complex, mas daghan. So an organism can be unicellular, such as bacteria, or multicellular, just like us, organisms, plants, animals, including us humans. So unicellular organisms can perform all essential functions which enable it to grow, survive, and reproduce. Pero pinaka-basic ni siya nga type of organism, or organism, such as bacteria. Then multicellular, such as us humans, more complex in structure and function, but the mechanism on how it is able to live is still the same with the simple life forms. Okay, so those are the difference between the 2. So to further discuss, so diba ganina, I told you cell as a basic unit of life, nga no, basic unit of life siya, because the cell operates similar to a complete machine, such as, for example, a car, diba? It's a machine, which has many compartments that perform different but interrelated and interconnected functions. Imagine a cell, inana kagamay. But each part, called the organelles, mini organs of the cell, perform different functions, interrelated functions. Okay. Then cells come from pre-existing cells. To explain that, again, cells cannot be spontaneously created, but, it will always be a product of reproduction from a pre-existing cell, according to Mazzarello, 1999, also stated earlier. Okay. So spontaneous generation again is not possible. Okay, so examples of postulate 1, unicellular organisms. Okay, an example is an amoeba. I'll give you pictures so that you will know how these organisms look under the microscope. That is the amoeba, a unicellular organism. Another is bacteria. Okay, a unicellular organism as well. We have Euglena. Okay, Euglena is green in color because it's able to undergo photosynthesis just like a plant. Okay, diba? But it's an animal actually. Okay, next, Paramecium is also unicellular. Then the protozoans are also unicellular with small hair-like structures called the cilia. Okay, mga living organisms is that. And then for multicellular organisms, of course, the fungi or the common one is mushroom. Pwede po mga molds, no? This one is actually created in the lab, placed in petri dishes, fungi. Okay, we also have plant cells, of course. Then animal cells. For example, this is the red blood cells of the chicken. Okay, similar with humans, pero more like oval shape or oblong shape ang ilahang cells. Then for human cells, red blood cells are actually circular in shape, different usually from the chicken red blood cells. But the same, they are multicellular. Then for postulate 2, breast cancer cells. Okay. Okay, this is an example of the breast cancer cells. Then human embryonic stem cells, which can be used in gene therapy. Stem cells are cells in our body that still has no specific function and yet to develop into a specific type of cell. Okay. Then skin cells, of course, we can find their epidermis, and the portion below is called the dermis. Okay, so thank you for listening. So I hope you learned something today. Tune in for another video lesson on this next part of your module. Okay, so stay tuned and see you again next time.